Morning, everybody, again, and welcome to the third in our series, Everything is Energy. So today I'm very, very happy to introduce to you our co-host, Alex Lenferna. I mean, some of you have already met Gary Kukumur in the first seminar. The three of us are co-hosting this seminar together. Alex is a postdoc in development studies at the Nelson Mandela University on an NIHSS fellowship under the umbrella of the Iscia chair. So if that's not already a mouthful, he's also the co-founder of the Climate Justice Coalition, and they are working to advance a transformative climate justice agenda. So Alex will be speaking today about privatization, energy inequality, and renewable revolutions. I particularly like that phrase, renewable revolutions. And I'm very eager to hear more about clean, safe, affordable energy for all. How do we make that miracle happen? So Alex, welcome, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning, everybody. Nice to be here with you. I've got a little slideshow that I'll put up in a second, but I just thought I would show my face for a little while before I do that. So yeah, let me dive right in, and I'm quite fortunate insofar as that I'm following the presentations that were given by Gary, as well as and so on as well on energy storage, and so this will follow on quite nicely from that. See if I can share my screen. Hopefully that's showing well. Everybody can see it okay?
Yes, it's perfect, thanks.
Great. So yeah, today our focus is really on privatization, how it could impact energy inequality, and the possibility for renewable revolutions that maybe drive us away from deepening energy inequality to more energy equality, to more energy access that's clean, reliable, safe, and affordable. And I wanted to start off the talk by just kind of getting one thing out of the way, which is to say that, you know, the sort of background assumption through a lot of this talk is that renewable energy really is the future. And so that we should be, you know, a sane government would be investing heavily in a rapid and a just transition to renewable energy. And the reasons for this are many. They're environmental, they're economic. You know, renewable energy, the form of solar, wind, and storage, is now the cheapest form of energy the Earth's ever seen, really. Didn't used to be the case. So if you look at this graph here, it was the case that solar and wind used to be more expensive energy technologies, but due to the drops in costs of energy over the last few decades, they have become by far the cheapest energy on Earth, right? Another reason for them is that they're more job creating compared to the alternatives. They're more labor intensive, so they create more jobs. For a country like South Africa, renewables are also quicker and easier to build, which is important because we've got a load shedding crisis created by a lack of sufficient energy supply. So if we want to fix that the quickest, then solar and wind take about 1.8 years on average to build, compared to, let's say, disasters like Medupi and Kusile, which after more than a decade are still not complete, are dysfunctional, have construction defects, and so on. And then, of course, just a reinforcing reason to move to renewables is the fact that we are in a climate crisis. The science is quite clear that we need to rapidly get off coal, oil, and gas, which are the biggest contributors. So that's kind of just a background assumption throughout this talk, that renewable energy really is the future. But the question that this talk is trying to deal with is, what does that future really look like? Because a renewable energy future is not necessarily a one that's just, not necessarily one that's more equal. It's, you know, renewables are a technology, but how they're deployed, I guess, is the big question. So in order to look to the future, I guess we also have to look a bit to the present. And, you know, thinking about Eskom's dysfunction, I think we're all painfully aware that, you know, Eskom has a reliance on pretty unreliable, aging, and expensive coal plants, which have been badly maintained, been run into the ground, and so are quite dysfunctional, leading us to a combination of load shedding as well as load reduction, which I don't think is talked about enough. And I think I'm really glad that Terry Maggot will be speaking to the impacts of load reduction and the energy racism that it brings later on in this series. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about the impacts. Similarly, Eskom's deepen debt, it's over 400 billion, although it fluctuates because we hold a lot of that debt in US dollars. And then, of course, we see deep corruption in its management, and also Eskom being the biggest polluter on the continent. So I think what we've seen in the face of, Eskom dysfunction, and in the face of, a lot of problematic management of state-owned entities, a lot of the public sector being in deep trouble, is increasing calls for privatization. So DA being one of the, the main voices in the call for the privatization of Eskom, which, aligns somewhat with the DA's more right-leaning economic policy, which is, often in favor of privatization. But similarly, we also have the ANC, who likes to talk left, but often walk right. So this is Cyril Ramaphosa saying we are not privatizing Eskom, we are restructuring Eskom, a process that will allow the private sector to be our partners. Now, I think if we actually examine the level of policies that are happening around privatization, that Ramaphosa's statement could be seen to be somewhat untrue on some levels. So I just thought I would give a little bit of an overview of the various different measures that are kind of driving a pretty large-scale privatization, particularly of energy generation in the country. And I think this is where we can separate out a few things. There is the process of unbundling Eskom, which is trying to separate it out into distribution, into transmission, and into generation. And purportedly, this process is still underway. And so ANC claims that the transmission and distribution will still be publicly owned. But when it comes to generation, it looks like privatization is very much in full swing. And so here we have the words of Professor Mark Swilling, former chairperson of the Development Bank of South Africa's board, who says we are facing a disorderly transition driven entirely by market forces. And I think this is really the reality in South Africa. And there's a few examples that I want to point to that kind of show just how much the private sector is kind of in the driving seat of energy generation. So earlier this year, we had a budget bailout by the Enoch Godongwana when he announced his big budget in February, I believe. And one of the elements of the budget was a significant amount of funds that was going, I think over 200 billion rand, that was going to Eskom to help them deal with their debt. One of the conditions of that was that Eskom would be prevented from making any new investments, large-scale investments in energy generation. So what that means is that Eskom is kind of stuck with what they have now, which is predominantly coal power generation. And this means that Eskom's future in energy generation is a very limited one. There was, for example, a study in the US that showed that pretty much every single one of their coal plants, except for one, could be more affordably replaced with renewables, wind, and storage, right? So Eskom's stuck with these legacy coal assets that are dysfunctional, that are expensive to run, and that could be more, more economically, arguably replaced with renewable energy. So when we look to the future of Eskom, that generation side with this condition on the bailout is kind of looking at a wind down of Eskom as an energy generator. Within that budget bailout as well was tax incentives. Now, some have celebrated these tax incentives. They go to households and businesses for solar, so that they can, get some tax deduction if they invest in solar for their own generation. But this basically is incentivizing the private sector to drive a lot of that investment. And I'll speak to why that's a problem a little bit later on in this talk, because it could drive and deepen energy inequality. And so if you think there's a quote by Rudolph Goldscheil, who says the budget is the skeleton of the state stripped of all misleading ideologies. And so even though the ANC says they're not driving energy generation, when you actually examine the budget, they are driving significant privatization of the energy sector. You couple that with some of the other factors. So there used to be in place a cap on energy generation in terms of you needed to get a license in order to employ energy of over 10 megawatts, and then it was lifted to 100 megawatts. and then was removed altogether, right? And this was basically meant that the private sector can do wide-scale investments in their own energy generation without having to apply for licenses. And so this has virtually unleashed the private sector to invest as they want within renewables. Now, in terms of getting new energy on board, some have celebrated this, but what's worrisome about it is that, you know, the investments that the private sector make are not subject to the same sort of progressive policies and conditions that things like the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program is. Now, that long name, the REI4P, is the state sort of public-private investment into renewables. So it's where the state procures from the private sector for renewable energy projects like solar and wind. But as part of that, there are certain conditions around helping communities with partial community ownership of those assets, setting up community resources, of investing in communities. None of that is applicable when we think about just the lifting of licenses for private sector to invest as much as they want in renewable energy. Now, the REI4P program is not perfect, and it's, you know, it's very much driven predominantly by large capital in the private sector. But even that is being displaced by this lifting of licenses. And we saw that, for example, in the Eastern Cape, where there was a bid window for this REI4P for wind power to come in, and they couldn't secure access to the grid or to the transmission lines because that had been all bought up by these private sector players, right? So even that public-private program is being squeezed out now by the private sector. And then maybe the last example of, you know, the private sector playing, you know, the dominant role is the President's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And the Just Energy and Transition Investment Plan is a 1.5 trillion rand plan over the next 3 to 5 years that the president's put in place to drive investment into renewable energy, to green hydrogen, and into electric vehicles. Now, it has some flowery language about the need for more social ownership, but the problem is, if you look at the amount of money that's allocated, only 0.1% of those funds is dedicated to social ownership. So on each of these fronts, we see that the private sector is very much in the driving seats of energy generation. Now, I think for a South African audience who is very much fed up with the failures of the public sector, it can be understandable that there's anger towards the state, and understandable also that there is a desire to move to the private sector. Oh, Gary, you said my screen sharing is copying my screen, so we're seeing your next slide too. Oh, I think it's sharing the wrong one. Let me try change my screen sharing so that you see the proper screen. Sorry about that. Gary sent me a private message saying that the wrong screen is being shared. I'm going to try fix this. I don't know why sorry about that, folks. Just give me a second here and hopefully I'll have it up and running. Okay. And then let's do share screen. And voila. Okay. Fingers crossed, that's better. Can somebody give me a sense that that's better from?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I think there's an understandable anger that folks have around the failures of the public sector and of state-owned entities. And, you know, I think there's a desire across a large swath of the public for the private sector to step in where the state has failed. But I think this is an important moment where we reflect on the words of Noam Chomsky, who says that's the standard technique of privatization. You defund, you make sure things don't work, you get people angry, people are very angry, and then you hand it over to private capital. I've written this other piece, and I won't go into detail, but just looking at the long history of the failures to invest in generation in South Africa, and how the ANC has been very much laying the groundwork for privatization since 1998, with the corporatization of Eskom. And so this has been very much a long process moving towards privatization. So I thought I would spend a bit of time thinking about what's so bad about privatization, and particularly of renewable energy. And I think two of the things that are most needed in order to invest in renewable energy is land and money. You need land somewhere to put the solar or the wind or the batteries, and then you need the money to invest in it. And so in South Africa, when we think about who controls the land, for example, we see that, white people still own about 72% of the total farms and agricultural holdings by individual landowners. And also that's so in terms of racial inequality and land ownership, but then in terms of gender inequality, 72% is also male owned, and that's according to the 2017 land audit. Of course, agricultural and farm holdings are just one element of land. There's also buildings and so on, which are places where you can have renewables. It's not so easy to get the data on, but I think a proxy for that can often be wealth, right? So looking at money in South Africa is the world's most unequal country, where 10% of the population owns 80% of the wealth, according to the World Bank from last year. And so if we leave the transition up to the private sector, those that will be able to invest in renewables will be the minority, who will be able to invest the most and benefit the most from renewables, will be the minority that holds the most land and money, right? And so I think this speaks to why a market-led transition, which doesn't put in place transformative policies to ensure that there is redistribution as we make this, could maintain and deepen some of those inequalities, because the people who are best positioned to invest in the renewable energy future are those who hold the land and the money. Another worry about privatization comes from the revenue we get from energy sales. And Gary has touched on this in an earlier presentation, where municipalities get 30% of the revenue from the sales of electricity. So it's their biggest source of revenue. And this is supposed to function as a progressive way that the well-off subsidize services for the less well-off. The poor are also supposed to get free basic electricity, although that's quite insufficient, and often it's not even paid to the poor. PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute, has some very important research showing just how much the free basic electricity grant is getting misappropriated and not paid to the poor. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed, both by increasing it so that it meets the basic needs of poor households, but also ensuring that it actually reaches those households in the end, which it is not. But the thing is, when we think about that revenue generation model, the current policies that are being put in place kind of reverse what is supposed to be a relatively progressive model. So with the 2023 budget, it provides tax breaks for companies and households to invest in solar, right? So those tax breaks means less tax revenue for public services. It also means more money for the relatively well-off. And at the same time, by encouraging households to invest in solar and businesses, there's less electricity sales, meaning less revenue for municipalities. So in terms of policies that are supposed to drive deeper equality, unfortunately, these tax breaks are not where the money is at. So we need to find fairer solutions than what the government is putting in place in terms of providing market-led solutions that tend to benefit the wealthier. And one of them is a possibility of a fairer feed-in tariff, right? So instead of perhaps providing tax breaks to relatively well-off households, what you could instead do, which Cape Town is doing to a certain extent, is to provide incentives for people to sell their excess back into the grid. The benefit of this is that this would actually bring on needed additional generation, whereas providing just tax breaks for households would mean that they're not necessarily selling back into the grid. And you could structure the feed-in tariff in a way that municipalities could buy electricity at a lower price and then sell it back at a higher price to both recover on grid management costs and for them to continue earning revenue. So this is one possible example, right? And I think what's really important is that the feed-in tariff should also be lower so as to help pay for the grid, which is a public good, right? And I think this is where we should make a distinction between being a good grid citizen versus a grid profiteer. I think there's a lot of people that want to use the grid, which is maintained by the state, to profiteer by selling huge amounts of renewables into the grid and making a lot of money. Now, on one hand, it's not a bad thing to try and sell back clean energy into the grid, but if you're not doing that in a way that ensures that you're paying for your fair share of the upkeep of the grid itself, which is a public good, then you're kind of being somewhat parasitical on the broader public good. So I think this is where aiming for being a good grid citizen is a better model, where you pay your fair share of upholding the grid. If you're a wealthier citizen, you also help to continue to subsidize public services for others, rather than, I think what is a push by some to do grid profiteering through renewables, right? Now, the feed-in tariff could help, it could be more fair in some ways than the tax breaks that the government's putting in place. However, one thing it won't address is this inequality, right, in land, and who owns the land and who owns the money. So it could help a little bit more on the question of municipal revenue and so on, although there's a lot more work that needs to be done in thinking about municipal revenue schemes as we move towards more renewables. And some of that we'll talk about in a bit in terms of municipal ownership of renewables and so on. But feed-in tariffs by themselves won't address this underlying question of who has the land and money to make the investments, right? And I think this is where, we need to situate the move to renewables within the need to move towards a more just society. And so here I turn to the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or COSATU, is calling for South Africa's just transition to be funded through a range of progressive taxes. It could be wealth taxes, resource rents taxes, taxes on environmentally damaging activities, even land value taxes as well. And I think this is really important, not only as a measure to help with energy equality, but also because if we look back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, one of them in terms of reparations for apartheid, to help address the wealth inequality that had come about as a result of apartheid, was for a wealth tax. And so this would also help be a fulfillment of long overdue, not only environmental, but also apartheid reparations to address the still very deep economic and ecological inequalities that South Africa faces. So on one hand, that's how we could look at the funding revenue of who funds, or how we better fund a more progressive transition. And then in terms of how we then share the benefits on the other end in terms of who generates the energy, one way to do that, of course, is through recognizing that poor communities in South Africa often don't have access to capital or to land to be able to invest in renewables, is to ensure that the state is the one that's investing in renewable energy. And I know people are fed up with Eskom, and we definitely need to reform Eskom's model. But this is what the Green New Eskom campaign driven by the Climate Justice Coalition is about. It's about ensuring that Eskom is investing in renewable energy so that they can, because they have access, in theory, they could have access to the land and to the capital needed to make these investments, and they can share the benefits of the lower costs of renewable energy through progressive revenue models that bring those benefits to poor households. And so, reclaiming the important role of public utilities in delivering energy as a public good. So that's one way to do it. And this is the Green New Eskom campaign. It's driven by the Climate Justice Coalition, and it's demanding a rapid and just transition to a more socially owned, renewable energy powered economy that provides clean, safe, and affordable energy for all. And importantly, because we work with trade unions and workers in mining affected communities, is that as we make this transition to renewable energy, it's vital that we think about the workers and the communities that are dependent on coal, and ensuring that we invest in alternative economic models for those areas that ensure that no one's left behind. And I think here again is a space where the government's commitment to austerity and to privatization has meant that the amounts of funding that is being dedicated to help communities is minuscule compared to the actual demand that is needed for in terms of helping communities really not be left behind. And so, for example, Groundwork, which is a partner organization of the coalition, just released a report on Komati coal power station And what we see there is that, workers are being left behind, and that communities are not properly aware of the transition that's going on. They're not finding alternative economic opportunities. And what we've seen historically in South Africa, for example, when the gold mining sector went into significant decline, is it left behind devastating ghost towns, which are, haunting areas of poverty and inequality. And so, we've got to work incredibly hard to ensure that we don't duplicate that unjust transition model when we do the coal transition to renewables in South Africa. And I think there's understandable fear from workers and communities that the transition just won't deliver for them. Some of that is spurred on by coal lobby interests trying to stoke resistance, but a lot of that is legitimate, also grounded in just failures to make the investments needed in the transition. Anyway, so that's the Green New Eskom campaign, is about pushing for Eskom itself to be a driving model for renewables, but also for the Eskom to use its ability to procure to drive localization of renewable energy. And I think this is important because when we think about job creation in renewables, often, it's recognized that renewables create more jobs than coal. And that's true at a certain level, but a lot of those jobs are in the manufacture and in the supply chain of building out renewables, right? And so this is where green industrialization policies are really important, so that South Africa is localizing a lot more of that and building more job creation locally. And unfortunately, this is also another area where if you examine the President's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, only 0.1% of the funding goes towards localization. And so instead, what we're probably looking at with the driving of the market forces is the importation of renewables from elsewhere, rather than the driving of localization, which would create more jobs. And so this is another area where we can push for social ownership and benefits across the renewable supply chain. But this is where the government, unfortunately, is not delivering at the moment. So apart from using the state as a means to ensure broader benefits, another way, of course, of bringing more benefits to folks is through socially owned renewable energy. And I think this is why I'm very happy to be affiliated with Nelson Mandela University, which got me interested in coming and working with the university, is how there is the Transition Township project, which is piloting socially owned renewable energy models. And I won't talk too much about that because we will have a couple of talks that focus in on that. But I think this is a really vital area of thinking about how can we ensure that the benefits and ownership of renewable energy end up in the hands of those that have historically been left out and marginalized in South Africa's economy and society. And maybe just to focus on one particular form of socially owned renewable energy, which is the possibility for things like agrivoltaics, as well as wind turbines in agricultural areas. So agrivoltaics is, as the name suggests, it's a sort of a mashup of agriculture and photovoltaics. And this is where you can put PVs alongside agriculture, right? Solar PV. And I think if we could couple this sort of practice with land reform, it would be an incredible way of ensuring that renewable energy is a vehicle for transformation. As things stand, renewable energy is very much perceived in the broader public as being something driven by European multinationals. Some of that is the result of problematic propaganda by the likes of Gwede Mantashe and so on. But some of that does reflect the reality of renewable energy not yet being a vehicle for transformation. So you could imagine a project of land reform, which gave small farmers who have new land investments in community-owned renewable energy. And the benefits of that could be manifold. So agrivoltaics, for example, they provide a source of income. So it could help, relatively new farmers have a somewhat steady source of income to help them as they, develop their agriculture. And it could also help them to weather some of the climate impacts that we're going to see in South Africa. So, for example, if they go through a tougher period for their farming, then photovoltaics could provide a source of income to weather them against some of those shocks. Additionally, the benefits of photovoltaics is that it actually protects crops from a few things. One is from if you have very intense sun and heat, that can be quite damaging to crops. And in certain parts of South Africa, that's very much a problem. So it provides some shade, both for plants, but also for animals. And additionally, it can provide protection against harsh rains. And as we're seeing across South Africa, as climate change hits more and more, we are seeing, much more extreme weather events, much more extreme downpours. And so, there is some co-benefits there. So I'm very excited about the possibility of land reform coupled with social ownership of renewable energy. And I think if we had a much more forward-thinking government, this would be one of the major programs of transformation we'd be seeing in this country. Unfortunately, that is not yet reality, but hopefully that's something that civil society can change and drive this more and more. But in order for this to happen, you need all sorts of supportive policies, because when we think about how do we ensure that small-scale farmers or township communities have access to the capital needed to invest in renewable energy, unfortunately, a lot of the time we just don't have the right policies in place. And so, for example, even this 1.5 trillion Rand investment program from the president dedicates a minuscule amount of money towards helping out with socially owned renewables. And what we have through that program is basically you have public money that's subsidizing private generation of renewables by investing in the infrastructure that will help the private sector come in to generate energy. And I think what we should instead be pushing for is for public money to help invest in a just transition that puts the public good at the forefront of it. And that also involves using renewables as a vehicle for transformation. So maybe I'll just leave it here. I think I want to give some time for discussion with just a couple of questions. And I think one of the questions is that, as things currently stand, we're using the energy and climate crisis as kind of a vehicle for disaster capitalism, where, it's being used to push through privatization, it's being used to push through austerity and all sorts of very harmful measures. And I think what we're trying to build, as progressive civil society, is instead to use the energy and climate crisis as a moment for justice and transformation and a better life for all. And the potential is there. Renewables as a technology can bring much more distributed benefits. It can be much more distributed models of ownership, unlike coal, oil, and gas, where you require immense amounts of capital in order to be able to extract it. With renewables, it could be a much more equitably owned model. But whether we unlock that full potential does remain to be seen. And as things stand, it seems that South Africa is very much driving a market-driven transition that will concentrate those benefits in the hands of a relative minority, whereas we have the possibility to drive a more just transition that brings broader benefits to all. So I'll leave it there. And if you feel like getting in touch, you're welcome to email me. If you want to find out more about the Climate Justice Coalition's work, we've got our website there. Got my website if you want to look at my work as well. And then, yes, I think I'm obliged to always give thanks to the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences, who supports my postdoc. So I'll make sure I get that done as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Alex. Sure, lots to think about. I think what I'll do maybe is just dive directly into the chat and ask Ethel to speak to his question. And then if you have questions to ask, then I will first of all give the floor to Janet next, and then Gary after that. Okay, Ethel? Ethel, would you like to speak to your question, or?
Thanks, Andrea. Sorry.
No problem.
I'm struggling to unmute there. It's more of a combined compact, working together with civil society, working together with academic bodies, and with the industries involved as well to recognize ESG, environment, social governance issues, and also with the social corporate responsibility. Now we know that has been used ad length to justify all sorts of wrongs in society at times as well. But what I was putting out in the chat there is that ESG, this basically encompasses ESG into society, and we have to bring together the social actors and basically combine them with those strategies, social entrepreneurship, etc., etc., etc.
Okay, thanks, Ethel. Alex, comments?
Yeah, agreed. I think we can't see renewable energy as sort of an isolated intervention. So the idea that we should be coupling it with social entrepreneurship, eco-tech construction, food security, and so on, I think is a good point by Ethel. And I think this is actually where the KwaZulu project that Janet and so on, Janet Cherry, is doing in KwaZulu has things like food generation, waste management, water harvesting, using recycled materials as part of the construction. So is attempting to get at some of that. I think the ESG side from corporations is a tricky one because, you know, the ESG element from a lot of corporates tends to be like a way of somewhat superficially engaging with environmental and social issues as a way of, you know, trying to give the sheen that there's green capitalism and things can kind of continue as they are with just like a little bit of a friendlier capitalist face or corporate face. And I think we should be very careful about that because often it's greenwashing, often it's not meaningful transformation. And I think this is where we should look much more to the strength of, you know, regulatory bodies and redistribution of resources and, you know, properly ensuring that corporates aren't given a free rein to, you know, implement sort of superficial ESG measures instead of, you know, properly regulating them and taxing so that we can invest in the public good. Because, yeah, often corporates don't deliver on that public good element in a very meaningful way. You know.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Janet, nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And Alex, I could put in my video as well. So,
Yeah.
Alex, thanks so much for a really good critique. I mean, I think I think you know that that we're speaking the same language broadly here. But I wanted to dive a little bit into the President's Climate Commission and the JETP IP financing model. And I mean, I completely agree with you about the tax incentives now, that it's only businesses and wealthy households who will benefit from that. I mean, township communities who are getting free basic services aren't in a position to invest in solar, and they don't even pay tax. So like tax incentives is a meaningless incentive for them. But I think that's what we're exploring in the township model. And I was also really interested in the agrivoltaics and land reform as another complementary solution, if you like. But in terms of the JETP IP, I wanted to just offer to this seminar and other people in the Nelson Mandela University who are working on this space, that we have been given a contract by the President's Climate Commission and NEDLAC to look into socially owned renewable and models. And I mean, Alex, obviously you will participate in this process, but we'll work out how exactly we're going to do that. But I wanted to just put on the table, I mean, I wanted to delve a little bit into your assertions about the amount that is allocated to localized production and to socially owned renewables. which are two different things. And you used a figure of 0.1%, which I'm not sure how you derived that figure. My understanding is that the majority of the JET-P financing, which is available from Europe and United States, from the countries of the North, is allocated to two things. The one is green industrialization. So it involves investment in well, three things actually. One is investment in industries like electric vehicles, lithium batteries, photovoltaics, etc., which I think we've agreed is important. The second is expanding the grid and the capacity of the grid to be able to accommodate inputs from renewables in whatever way, whether it's socially owned or privatized or whatever. And that expansion of the grid, we also can't really argue against it. I mean, it's absolutely necessary. And then the third thing is the just transition for the coal industry and Mpumalanga communities. And of course, that also has to be accommodated. So, what is actually left over for socially owned renewables? Well, very little in that model. But I think we've got a window in which we can influence the PCC and the JET-P in terms of how that funding is spent. But there's the body of funding which is coming from the countries of the North, basically, which are committed to supporting South Africa in the transition. And then there's also President Ramaphosa's commitment to raise additional funding, private sector funding and loan funding and so on, which will make up that however many trillion or billion or whatever it is. I mean, I struggle even with the figures because I don't know what they mean. Like what is this going to cost and where is the money going to go and so on. But you could maybe look into that a little bit more. And the last thing is just so I don't think that it's 0.1% for social ownership and 0.1% for localization. I don't know if you saw yesterday, but there was a big meeting on provincial industrialization, which talked about how much is being invested in gas, which is a problem for us. And secondly, in electric vehicles and battery development in the East and photovoltaics in the Eastern Cape. So, I mean, that is happening, but I don't think that is, I think if that's what you mean by localization, then I don't think it's 0.1%. What government means by localization is South African industry, production of components. That's essentially what they mean. So, how you define localization and how much is allocated to it is another issue. And then just the last thing is about the JET-P. I mean, not the JET-P, the REAP program. So the REAP program, the community benefit from REAP, I think the studies have shown that it's not going to socially owned ownership and to community ownership of resources. It's going into, I mean, there's a pool of money, which is quite big, but it's going into sort of arbitrary development issues like supporting local libraries or something like that, which is things the government should be doing anyway, or municipalities should be doing anyway. So it's not going into a change in ownership patterns. And, again, that's a place to lobby for how that funds should be used. Anyway, sorry, that was a bit long, but I mean, these are really important issues.
Yeah, they are. Thanks, Janet. Alex?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think some really important points there. And I think with the JET-IP, it is important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there are some important things being funded in there, as you point out. But there are big questions about who benefits from those investments and how we distribute those benefits. In terms of where I'm getting the figures for both the localization and the social ownership side. So that comes in the electricity sector element of the JET IP plan. So I actually pulled it from the 200 and something page document that the president dropped just before the big UN climate summit last year. And there they specify that 1.5 billion and I think 1.6 billion respectively is going to be dedicated to localization and is going to be dedicated to social ownership. So each of those is 0.1% of 1.5 trillion investments. It is, there arguably might be other elements of the investment that might help spur on localization. And so I guess there is a definitional question of, what is strictly helping with localization, what isn't. But in terms of what is earmarked specifically for those elements, then it is just, 0.1% for each of them. And yeah, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program definitely has its limitations. And I think there's big questions we should be asking about the model of relying on big power companies to be the ones that try to develop or deliver on developmental goals that are supposed to be the goal of the state. And REI4P to a certain extent had that of this corporate social responsibility where you invest in schools or libraries and you give community funds. And it's not always clear that, those power companies are the best positioned to do that work. And I think we've seen it problematically in mining sectors historically. And so is that really the model we should be deploying, particularly if it's delivering limited benefits of social ownership? So maybe the REI4P needs to be very critically engaged. And I know, for example, Megan Davies down at Stellenbosch University is doing some good work critically digging into that. And I imagine there's lots of others too. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Gary.
Thanks, Alex. That was very a great critique, and I think it's a very necessary thing as we kind of rush to through this technological change. A broad question to you would be is whether technological transitions can be ordered. Can they be orderly? In my sense, they always are a mishmash and a whole bunch of things. And then I just wanted to comment on the RIPP stuff, is that South Africa has experimented with a number of power generation models. So the first thing it was that it was private generated, and then it was consolidated under Eskom, and basically Eskom did that by undercutting the private companies. So that's in the origin of Eskom. And then it went through coal, which was because it was cheap, it was accessible, it was steam generated relatively easily, and that set up the high felt sort of coal belt and the real problem for us in terms of just transition. And then you had the ANC take over, and they vacillated along because they were really debating this private public thing, and then eventually they went with public. And they did the Kusile and Medupi, the sort of the world's biggest coal power plants, and that was a failure because of how they managed that project, and just the nature of mega projects too. And then you have had the REI 4P, which I think was a very carefully constructed thing that tried to do a whole bunch of things at the same time. And so the one component that you haven't mentioned is that it is a very strong Black empowerment vehicle, and that it hasn't concentrated Black empowerment in one partner per se, but there is a consolidation that's taking place, and Ramaphosa comes under a lot of criticism because of his rainbow links, rainbow energy links there. But there is that thing that I sent you in terms of the Tsitsikamma wind farm that worked with an existing community trust to be co-owners of that, and I think it's 9% of that thing. So not just the CSI component, but I agree with you. I mean, if you look at the Jeffreys Bay wind farms and that, the stuff that they're investing in is really they're just trying to blow the money. They're not actually looking at the long-term effect of those things. And as Janet says, that they are duplicating existing sort of estate thing. But I'm not sure, so in my mind, I think the big issue for me is the feed-in tariff is the big issue for me. So the tax break, I agree with you entirely. The tax break is going to benefit only the middle to upper class incomes and businesses. But if you change the feed-in tariff, that's the one issue, and the seller of electricity is the other one. So if you so Janet's project, for instance, can register themselves as a seller of electricity, and that gives you, or your municipality can become a seller of electricity, and that can generate for them their revenue. So that can address that thing. But Janet's project will only sell electricity into that thing if there is a feed-in tariff that makes it valuable. At this point in time, they can only zero base the thing. So as an investment decision, it's not a great one for generating revenue. It's a great decision in terms of securing your energy supply, but a local community typically doesn't need a lot of energy, comparatively speaking, you know. But they have a great opportunity to produce more, so, you know, become a revenue generator. I mean, it's very complex then to have 100 solar panels in a community and managed and cleaned and all that kind of stuff. But in theory, it's possible, you know. I'm not sure that we can claw this thing back into an ordered transition at this point. Is the sort of concluding comment that I make. I think that it is now a scramble, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it. But I think the importance is to emphasize more and more the projects like Janet and them are running as an alternative version of what private industry is expressing. Sorry, thanks. Rather long, my apologies.
Thanks, Gary. Alex, comments?
Yeah, no, thanks, Gary. I think we should do a whole seminar on the REI4P and the limitations. It's at one time both like quite limited in terms of its impact, but it's also one of the more successful energy models we've had. So I think we need to hold those like tensions in mind, and that like it's got significant limitations, but also in terms of delivering energy and benefits, it's one of the better models. But there are better models, I think, internationally that we maybe should look to. In terms of, you know, ensuring more beneficiation, more social ownership, and all of that. And I think, yeah, the Tsitsikamma is maybe one of the better REI4P projects that are worth looking into. And then, yeah, I think this question of disorderly transitions is a really important one. I was reading a piece that was sort of examining historical energy transitions, and they tend to be times of great social disorder. And I think partly what we're seeing globally right now is as a result of this big energy transition that's happening, which is unleashing all sorts of disorder, not just in the energy system, but rippling out across economies. And South Africa has, to a large extent, now unleashed the forces of the market to drive this transition, and how much we can put that back in the bottle. I think partly is a question of social contestation for movements to try and push back where they can, and to drive progressive policies and projects as much as possible. But yeah, I think the difficulty is once it is out, it's very hard to put it back in. So I think we are going to be really much fighting an uphill battle from here. And it's not exactly like the South African progressives or left is in their strongest moment in South African history either, in terms of being able to mount a meaningful push in the opposite direction. So yeah, I think we are in an interesting space, and how we get to a just transition from where we are there's a long walk to be had, but we need to push with urgency. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Alex. We have time to squeeze in one more question. There's a comment from Anton. Anton, would you like to speak to your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. This is a great talk. As the expression goes, I definitely agree with you in principle. It's in practice that I lose you somewhat on this one. From what I can gather, one of the underlying assumptions in your argument here is that a lot of the decisions at Eskom is a result of malice, right? So people at the higher levels kind of making unfavorable decisions in terms of the direction of this institution. But when you look at the SEO landscape in South Africa more generally, it's very hard to find examples of like SEOs are doing particularly well. I mean, most of our large SEOs have either failed or on the brink of failure. And so a green publicly owned Eskom, I 100% with you, would be ideal. But what would have to happen to avoid a green Eskom from going the same way as our SEOs in general? And are there other publicly owned models that are more directly connected to communities that can operate at the scale that we're talking about? Because a green Eskom would have massive capital investments, would be an enormous landowner. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And I think there is a open question even within the coalition to the extent in which Green New Eskom drives generation. I think there's definitely a role that Eskom could play in investing in new renewables. And actually, if you look at some of Eskom's investments in renewables, that's been some of their more successful examples of renewable generation, but it's like a few % of their overall generation itself. So I think it's also important to see where there has been success of Eskom in this space. But agreed, if you look at the broader landscape of SOEs, we're not exactly basking in the glory of public success. And so I think there are other models where you have more of a mixed, you have municipal owned renewables coupled with public utilities. And so it's a little bit more of a mixed model. For example, Costa Rica has a really interesting model where they've put caps on private generation so that only so much of it can be privately generated. And then within that, it's mixed municipal and public utility generation that fills in the roles. Now, it's a smaller country in a lot of ways, but it's a nice little model in terms of, how you can combine public utility with municipal generation, and with like allowing some space for the private sector, but ensuring that it doesn't dominate your energy future. So yeah, that's one example that comes to mind of maybe a bit more of a mixed one. I think within the sort of more progressive movement, there's definitely disagreement to the extent in which Eskom would continue to be a monopoly generator. But I think some would like to see Eskom continue in that role through renewables, but I think others are much more open to Eskom playing a strong role, but no longer being the full monopoly when it comes to generation, provided that we can ensure that the other generation is not just, full-on private sector with no progressive policies in place. So hopefully that helps. I serve as secretary for this coalition, so I do have to often negotiate the different positions that folks are bringing in terms of their visions of this. And the Green New Eskom campaign in some ways has a little bit of ambiguity in it in terms of what that model exactly looks like, because we've got multiple different bodies coming in who have differing visions, so that's something that there's room for disagreement.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Anton. We are actually edging, well, we've definitely run out of time. Janet, are your comments burning, or shall we hang on until the next seminar where Janet will be presenting? Would that be all right? Janet? Oh, they're just comments. Okay, great. All right. I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to hold you to an REI4P general seminar. We do have slots in our seminar series that we can use for things that come up out of the seminar. So yes, that sounds like an excellent idea. Thank you, everybody. It's been, again, it's a distressing and, it's an urgent questions. I think the presentations so far have been fabulous, and I'm very much looking forward to Janet's presentation. We're going to take a bit of a break for the recess, but her presentation will be, I think it's the 21st of April, but please don't hold me to that, but we'll advertise it in good time. Okay, thanks very much, Alex. And yes, hope to all see you at Janet's presentation next time.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciated the conversations.